We're waiting on a little bit of a technical issue, so I appreciate your patience. But it gives me the opportunity to say, this observatory up here used to set time at a time when there was a difference between observatory time and Ann Arbor time. So if you walked off campus in the 1870s, you might have to reset your watch by as much as 18 minutes because Ann Arbor was on a different clock. It's not going to take 18 minutes, I'm sure, but anyway. Okay, I'm not sure that was even 18 seconds, but anyway. So good evening and welcome to this Bentley reunion, this Making Michigan, the Bentley Library series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz, the director of the Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory. Welcome all of you to the observatory and welcome to our audience online on YouTube. I'm also extremely happy to have Fran Bluen join us this evening to talk about the remarkable collaboration between the Bentley Library and the Vatican Archives. It's a story about, among other things, important academic values, what can be accomplished when people of goodwill come together across institutions, how technological developments can suddenly make new things possible, how different archival philosophies push in very different directions, and of course, it's a story about an amazing repository of historical evidence. It's a story not without some tension and perhaps even a little intrigue, and I can't wait for the movie to come out, actually. From 1981 to 2013, Fran Bluen served as director of the Bentley Historical Library. Those of you who know the great accomplishments and stature of the Bentley know that Fran has been a key architect of that U of M treasure. He has done extensive work in understanding archives in international context. From 1999 to 2014, he led an ongoing exchange between the University of Michigan and the State Archives Administration of China. He has also done work relating to archival issues in France, Denmark, Russia, and Brazil. He is the author, with William Rosenberg of the History Department, of Processing the Past, Contesting Authority in History and the Archives. He has served on, He has served on a number of boards and commissions, most notably the Council for Library and Information Resources and the State of Michigan Historical Records Board. From 1984 to 2004, he led the effort about which he will speak tonight. That project was funded by a series of grants from the Getty Grant Program, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Fran arrived at U of M in 1974 as an archivist at the Bentley. Shortly thereafter, he completed a PhD in history at the University of Minnesota. He joined the faculty here in 1978 to develop a program in archival administration jointly housed in the History Department and in the then called School of Library Science. He retired from his faculty appointment in 2017. He currently serves as archivist for St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue in New York City. I've known Fran since the mid-1990s, and I really am honored to call him a dear friend. We first met when I was acting as the president's liaison to the Bentley Executive Committee and also working with him on the university's History and Traditions Committee, which he chaired. And I remember, this was in the very early days before my wife Barb had met him. She observed one day, "You always have a smile in the morning when you're going to be meeting with this Fran Bluen." And she was right, and I expect that I'm not the only person who feels that way. Fran is a fount of goodwill and sage advice. So please welcome me please join me in welcoming Fran Bluen.
Thank you, Gary. That's a very kind introduction, and I was always smiling when I had a meeting with Gary Krenz too. So and that continues to this day. I want to thank everyone from the Bentley. This is wonderful to see everyone. You're going to hear about stuff most of you lived through over those years, and maybe you'll learn a little something about what I was doing all those days that I wasn't at the Bentley and over in Rome, eating pizza and doing a few more things. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to talk about a project, and what's interesting is that the project began in 1984 And I'm using the end date of 2023 because it's still going on. So that is why I'm pleased to have a chance to talk with you tonight. What I want to do tonight is just introduce the Vatican Archives, talk a little bit about the facilities, what is it and where is it, the history of the archives, a very brief history, and then show you a few selected documents to give you a sense of the extraordinary range of the collection. It currently occupies over 45 miles of shelving, with the earliest records going back to the 9th century. So it's an extraordinary world treasure. And then I will conclude with a lengthy conclusion on the history of the Vatican Archives project at the University of Michigan. So let me just give you a few brief things. This is Vatican City, and many of you have visited it, I'm sure, but I did not realize that when you were wandering around the Vatican museums, you were also wandering around this location of the Vatican Archive. How do you do the pointer on this? Whoops.
Yeah, it's the...
Where is it? That one there? Do you see it? Oh, there. Well, there it is. Okay. Most of you who have visited the Vatican come in this way through St. Peter's Square. If you're coming in to do research or for business reasons, you enter in over here. And you walk up into this Belvedere complex that was built in the 16th century, most of it. And in there are the long corridors you walk through for the Vatican Library, if you know, Vatican Museums, rather. Sistine Chapel is over here. The entrance to the archives is right here. And all of this is the Vatican Archives. Above and below those corridors of the museum, on the other side, all of this. In addition, the archives, when I was working with them on the construction of St. Peter's, the Fabbrica di San Pietro, was housed in the ceiling of the cathedral up here in this little corner. Used to take a little elevator all the way up to get there. In addition, over here is the offices of what they call the Holy Office, and that's the archives of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, which I'll talk about later. And then outside of all of this, in the Piazza di Spagna, historically, though it's moved, was the archives of the what they call the Propaganda Fide, or the missionary arm of the Holy See. So the archives occupies an enormous range of space within the Vatican. As I say, you enter in the cortile of the Belvedere. If you've gone to the Vatican Museums and you're walking toward the Sistine Chapel and you go to this little corridor and look out a window, you look into this courtyard. The archives are in some wonderful rooms. These are the original rooms of the Vatican Archives, outfitted in 1620. And for 400 years, these rooms held the original papal registers, which were from the 12th to the 14th century. They've since been moved. This is another part with diplomatic correspondence. When I talk later on about the pilot project that we did it in these rooms. Beyond the beautiful frescoed and historic rooms, there are normal stack rooms like these that go on and on forever. They are huge. And then some of you may know this area in the Vatican Museums with this great courtyard. Well, under this courtyard are 2 floors of modern stacks that were constructed about probably 40, 50 years ago now, but temperature, humidity controlled and all of that. So it's quite a remarkable complex, and all of it funnels material into this, the reading room, where you can consult. So the history of the archives is very old and has an amazing history. It was first organized in the 12th century with Innocent III acknowledging the need for some organized record keeping, and launches the formal Vatican registers, which were the copies of letters that were sent out and about to heads of state and others in the known world. Then later were the emergence of new offices that administered the whole operation, with names like the Dattery, the Apostolic Camera, the Chancery, Rota, and those also began to produce records in substantial quantities, even in the 13th and 14th century. During the Avignon period, the archives were transferred to Avignon, and records were, of course, generated there during that 75-year period. Then returned to Rome later. The main period, though, of the archives begins in the 15th century with the reforms of Sixtus V, the founding of the Vatican Library, and space set aside for the Bibliotheca Secreta, which was for storing documents of special importance. Other documents were stored in the Castle San Angelo. In 1588, with the encyclical Immensa Aeterni Dei, Sixtus V, after the Reformation, organized the Roman Church into a much more formal structure. It became a bureaucracy, essentially. And as all bureaucracies do, it generated a lot of records. And so the archives by the 16th century become quite bulky. 1611, Paul V separates the Vatican archives from the Vatican Library and establishes those frescoed rooms I showed you. In 1656, Alexander VI ordered all inactive diplomatic records to be deposited in the archives. 1783, papal registers stored at Avignon were returned to Rome and added to the Vatican archives. And in one of the most bizarre chapters in the history of any archive, I think, in 1809, Napoleon, who had conquered Rome and imprisoned the Pope, decided that he was going to transfer all archives in his empire to Paris. And the first transfer was going to be the archives at the Vatican. So in 1809, he transferred the entire holdings of the Vatican archives in 3,200 carts, ox carts essentially, all the way from Rome to Paris. And they remained in Paris until 1814. And however, to get everything back, only 2,200 carts were required. And it's presumed that some very judicious triage was done, including some of the very controversial records of the post-Reformation Inquisition, which turned up missing. In 1870, with the unification of Italy, the archives, much of the Vatican archives, which were established for administrative purposes for the Papal States, I mean the sort of civic government of the Papal States, those archives were transferred to the State Archives of Rome. So in 1870, the collection was divided. Then in 1881, the Vatican Archives was opened for the first time to research. Leo XIII said, let them all come in and see what we've done. And that was important. Though the records were only available prior to 1815, that you can't see modern things there. In 1963, I don't know how to pronounce this, Hotchkiss play, The Deputy Premier. Some of you may know that. It was a famous play that opened up the question, I was talking earlier, of Pius XII and the Nazi regime. And that inspired a huge demand for papal documents to understand the role of the church during the Second World War. And this tension went on for decades. And it actually was only, as I see at the end here, 2020, when Pope Francis has actually opened the documents for the period of World War II for research. A couple of other things, just now material is open until 58. And for years, for centuries actually, from its beginning, the Vatican Archives was known as the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican's secret archives. And it was really meant to say that it was a private archives, it was a royal archive, it was subject, there was no public right to access. But over the years, the name secret started, created a lot of problems. And finally, in 2019, Pope Francis changes the name from the Vatican Secret Archives to the Vatican Apostolic Archives. So that, in a nutshell, is the history of the place. It's had its ups and downs over the centuries. The holdings of the Vatican Archives are nothing but spectacular. The things that you can find there amid the 45 miles of shelves are quite amazing. This, for example, is one of my favorites. This is the papal bull Inter Cetera from March 4th, 1493. And this is when Alexander VI divided the world between Spain and Portugal with one letter. Oops. Let's see, these are... here's an example of the Vatican Register. This is a letter from Pope John VIII from the 11th century. There are volumes of these letters in the series of the Vatican Registers. This is the earliest volume, volume number 1. Here, from 1521, is the letter of excommunication of Martin Luther. Here is a 1582 publication examining some of the problems with the Julian calendar. And I put this in homage to the fact that I'm giving this talk in the observatory. The Vatican, as I showed you, the entrance to the library, the archives there is right here, if I can get this to work, right here. But then there's this tower. This tower was built in 1560 and was a small observatory. And in the main room of that tower are frescoes of the four winds. And this is the fresco of the south wind. And if you look at it, you can see way up at the top a white dot. That's a hole in the wall that the sun shines through and casts a beam on a meridian carved into the floor. And in 1583, Vatican astronomers sat in that room for a year calculating the current calendar we use, the Gregorian calendar. Here is a letter from the Lords assembled in England urging the Pope to grant Henry VIII an annulment of his first marriage. And all those red ribbons and seals are the signature of those signing on to this position, which failed, of course. But I'm told that this is the origin of the notion of bureaucratic red tape. Here, in Miscellaneous Amaria number 10, if you look in there, you'll find the proceedings of the trial of Galileo. Here is a seating chart for the conclave held after the death of Pope Paul III, and after that, Julius III was elected. It's the seating chart where the people were supposed to sit in the Sistine Chapel in order to carve the votes, as is still the tradition today. I put that in there because during this sede vacante, they call it, this vacant period between papacies, Michelangelo was nervous that his employees were not going to get paid properly. And this is a letter he wrote to that effect in 1550, hoping to secure funds for his workers during that sede vacante. This is an interesting letter in the I don't know how to pronounce this exactly, the Quechua language of Peru. It's a letter of Clement VIII in 1603 to the indigenous population, celebrating the work of a Jesuit who was doing missionary work at the time. But it's one of the few documents of the Vatican Archives that's in indigenous language. Oops, wait a minute. Here's the draft of the famous encyclical on social justice by Leo XIII in 1891. And then, oops, I keep doing this. And then finally, this is from the archives of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which I'll talk about later. But that congregation includes the Index of Forbidden Books. And this is a promulgation of 1616, critical of a particular edition of the work of Copernicus. It was not against Copernicus himself, but it was against the editor who claimed that this scientific work was more accurate than Holy Scripture, and that had to be erased before publication was allowed. As I say, there are other major holdings of the Vatican archives, and this becomes important when we consider what we did. There's the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples of the Propaganda Fide. That arm of the Catholic Church in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries had responsibility for all of the world except for Southern Europe. All of the world. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or Holy Office, including the Post-Reformation Inquisition and Index of Forbidden Books, the Fabrica, which was the archive of the building of St. Peter's Basilica, the Archivio di Stato of Rome, which has the letters of the governmental processes of the Papal States. The Vatican Library also has a lot of archives which over the year have been transferred to it, including the Capella Musicale Pontificia, which has most of the original manuscripts of the composer Palestrina. And then there are other things. There's the Archives Nationales in Paris still has some things left over from Napoleon's venture. Trinity College Dublin has some Inquisition's manuscripts that got there, and nobody knows really how. And there also are still papal materials in the archives of Vaucluse in France, which relate to the Avignon period. So this stuff, it's a complicated collection. So the central question then for tonight is, how did the Bentley Library end up providing the scholarly world with the first comprehensive guide ever done to the archival holdings of the Vatican? So I'm going to tell you that story. So the initial idea, to begin with, in the late 1970s, I was involved with a project to help the Archdiocese of Detroit modernize its archives. And in that process, I met two people, Father Frank Canfield of Grosse Pointe and Sister Claudia Carlin, former librarian of Marygrove College and of the North American College in Rome. In the early 1980s, the two of them were working with the then prefect of the Vatican Library, Alphonse Stickler from Austria, to establish an American branch of the Friends of the Vatican Library. You all know about Friends groups. So they asked me to join that effort as a member of the board. So in 1984, it was announced that there would be a new prefect of the Vatican Library, an Irish priest named Father Leonard Boyle. So Frank Canfield and I traveled to Rome that fall to meet him. So while there, since I was teaching a course on archives here, and I was curious, I asked if I could take a look at the Vatican archives, especially the area housing the index and finding aids, see how it all worked. I was struck with how difficult it was to navigate. And I met the then newly appointed prefect, Father Joseph Metzler, who gave me a tour of the stacks. And seeing the material physically organized, grouped together by font in the stacks, made just the whole organization of the archives much clearer. It just presented a clarity you couldn't get just by going into the index room and looking at these various finding aids. And so at the time, though, there existed only two guides to the Vatican archives, and I brought them with me. One is this slender volume from 1951 by Karl Fink in German, And the other was Father Leonard Boyle, who was the new prefect of the library, another slender volume which looked primarily at medieval records. Each in its own way provided information, but for only about 25% of the holdings of the archives. The information provided by the archives itself, this is all they give you. If you want to know what's in the Vatican archives, even today, is this little list of just titles of series, grouped sort of haphazardly by the office that created them. And for the archivists in the room, you know how important it is to link records to the office that created them. So the guides had their problems. And let's see, that's the guide. So I had several meetings with Father Boyle, who spoke perfect English, and I was really impressed with his vision for the library. He wanted it to become more than a place where people came to find things. Rather, he wanted it to be a research center. He said, though, he had no authority over the Vatican archives. He really wanted the two institutions to be more integrated into a single research entity. He also was interested in the newly emerging information technology, which was pretty new and emerging in 1984. So we talked at length about the difficulties of finding aids in the archives, which he understood from doing his own guide. No comprehensive guide had ever been attempted, so the full extent of the collection of the Vatican archives was not known. You could not find it out. So we talked about the need for the integrated gateway to research resources of the library. We talked about maybe an integrated computer-based catalog that would integrate the archives and library materials. But it was just sort of a general discussion. But at the same time, the library and archives profession in the USA were developing a variation of the machine-readable cataloging format. Many of you who are connected to libraries will remember MARC. I mean, I guess we still use it, don't we? Don't we still use MARC? Yeah, I've been out of it for a while. We at the Bentley Library were moving ahead creating a MARC-based system to record and describe the holdings of our collection. It was a massive job. So I began to correspond with the archivist, Father Metzler, about doing a census of the archives, visiting every shelf of the archives, and perhaps preparing MARC records for each identifiable piece that was really quite easily identifiable in the stacks of the archives. So, let me see. There I am in 1985 with Father Boyle in the stacks of the Vatican Library. That room where we're standing holds 60,000 manuscript volumes from the Middle Ages through to the 17th century. And then the lower photo is my making a pitch to Father Metzler in the Vatican archives. Now, so I had this idea, and then at the same time, lots was happening at the same time. John Darms, many of you will remember John Darms, who at the time was Dean of the Graduate School, and also was a former head of the American Academy in Rome. He was intrigued by what I was thinking about, and immediately got on the phone and called Sophie Consagra, who was the president of the American Academy in Rome, and her office was in New York. So I went to New York to meet her to discuss my interest in a possible project. And in her position at the American Academy, she had the occasion to meet many scholars who were frustrated in how they could work with the holdings of the Vatican archives. So she became quite enthused and encouraging about what I was thinking. So in 1986, then, kind of moving this along, I visited with Father Metzler in Rome and suggested that we would try to organize a project that would describe the holdings of the archives in a way that was compatible with the latest information technology. Essentially, I was thinking of doing a MARC-based description of all the holdings of the Vatican archives. This clearly would be a major undertaking, requiring substantial funding. So the question then was, how would the Bentley Library convince anyone to give it money to do this work. In the spring of 1987, I traveled to Rome and met with Father Metzger at the archives and proposed that we would do a test project. Pushed a good bit by Father Boyle, who was really wanted this to happen. And Father Metzger thought he should do something about technology. I mean, it was in the air, but he really didn't know what to do. So he was interested particularly in something that would embrace the entire contents of the Vatican archives. So we were on the same page there. So he suggested that we begin with fonds of the Secretary of State, with the series of the Secretary of State for the period 1507 to 1815. So at the same time, Sophie Consagra had introduced me to several scholars who were willing to really underscore the need for this work based on their own research. And I, through my own contacts in this archival world, found many experienced archivists who could validate the methodology we were going to use. So the pieces were starting to come together. With that, in 1987, and here on the right, you can see, with a kind of pilot project grant from the Vice President for Research here at the University of Michigan, I, along with Tom Powers and Len Coombs, both staff members of the Bentley Library, and I think Len Coombs is watching, so I want to just say, Len, I still appreciate what you did. I'm not sure if Tom is, I'd appreciate Tom too, but I'm not sure if he's watching. So we traveled to Rome that fall to do the work. And through Sophie Consagra, we were in residence at the American Academy in Rome, where we also could meet scholars and talk about our work in that community. So in the 3 weeks we were there, the work proceeded efficiently. Len and Tom, who just quintessentially accomplished great archivists, were able to move through and create the MARC records for the various groupings. In the course of 3 weeks, we had created MARC records for 50 of the diplomatic records from that section of the archives. So the result was a full MARC-based description, as I say, of that section. So with those results in hand, and with the support of scholars noting the need for the project, and with the support of archivists validating the approach, I began to look for funding. And I'll outline the project specifics in a minute, but to make a very, very long story short, and to eliminate all the people who said no, we did get a grant of $120,000 from the Getty Grant Program, and that was matched by a grant of $112,000 from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So the project we proposed was we decided it was important to have sufficient time to visit all parts of the Vatican archives. So we would need to have complete access to the stacks, and we were given that, because it was only by actually viewing each font in the stacks that we could gather the information necessary to construct the individual MARC records. We would thus plan to visit each stack area, build a MARC record for each series we found on the shelves, and link those series or fonts to specific indexes with finding aids wherever that's a whole other. I'm going very light on all the technical aspects of this, but that we would do that. So we designed a one-year project with 2 staff visiting the stacks of the Vatican archives every day to do the work. And in those days, technology was new, and we had portable computers that we could take into the stacks, but they were not light. They were not light. And we had to, and also we found out that for safety reasons, not every night after everyone left, the Vatican turned the electricity off in the whole operation. So we couldn't leave the computers there to charge overnight. So we had to carry them home each night. But that was technology in those days. Working on this project was Elizabeth Yackel, graduate of the School of Library Science at the University of Michigan, and now it's interim dean. And she had been formerly the archivist at the Archdiocese of Detroit. And the second person was Catherine Gill, who was a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, an historian from Yale University, who we met while we were at the American Academy. Beth Yako had experience in the description of archival fonds that was up to date on the MARC AMC system, and Catherine Gill, a historian who had studied at the Vatican Archives' own School of Paleography and Diplomatics. She had a particular understanding of the nature of the records and also the various languages that were in use. So as I say, I'm passing over a lot of technical matters here, but in short, we propose to use the MARC system for archives to do the first ever complete survey of the holdings of the Vatican Archives and to mount that information in a database. In the process of doing that, we had, there were challenges, and one of the big ones is here. You can see in our guide, this is the guide here that we did. And this is the area of what's called the Camera Apostolica. And the Camera and how to describe that was a problem for us, given what we were trying to do. This important section consisted of the financial records of the Holy See, and the Holy See is the Catholic Church, the religious side, and the diplomatic side, in that the Vatican is a nation state. The financial records of the Holy See from 1279 to 1908, a massive amount of financial information. However, in 1870, as I mentioned, the records of the Vatican Archives, particularly those relating to the governance of the Papal States, were separated out of the Vatican's own archive and moved to the Archivio di Stato of Rome. Well, in the process, they split the financial records. But nobody was ever satisfied with the way they were split, because you know how financial records are. I mean, it wasn't neatly divided, where you had religious stuff on one side and government stuff on the other. So how to represent those records became a challenge. It was clear that we would have to include information on fonds outside of the Vatican Archives. We would have to include information on all records of the Camera. So we decided we would include the records, all the records of the Papal States that have been transferred from the Vatican Archives into the Archivio di Stato of Rome. And to do that, fortunately, there were printed guides that had most of the information we needed. We didn't visit that archives and do the full survey. But the important thing was no longer was our work to describe the archives of the Vatican, the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, that one archival institution, but we were essentially, from this point on, using the organization of the Holy See itself to describe the records. And where the records were located was subordinate to how they related to the organization of the Holy See. So we then considered separately housed documents in the archives of the Congregation for Evangelization of Peoples, the Propaganda Fide. We then were introduced to the archivist Anthony Ward, archivist for the Fabrica, on the archives of the building of St. Peter's, and the project went from this to this. And fortunately, we were able to do that because we applied for and received additional grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Lilly Endowment, in addition to a second grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So since we were linking all record series identified to specific offices of the Holy See, we needed to construct a brief history of each office that had existed in the organization of, in the Holy See. All the different, the Secretary of State, the Dattery, the Rota, the embassies. There were quite a few. So that work proceeded in Ann Arbor. And Sister Claudia Carlin, who worked with us, both an authority on papal documents and also very familiar with sources on the history of the Curia Romana, worked to, along with Len Coombs, to construct these various histories. Also in Ann Arbor, Len Coombs worked to ensure that each of the MARC records was properly constructed in compliance with the database rules of the then Research Library Information Network. So again, a long story short, by 1991, the shape of the project began to emerge more clearly. We had compiled histories from about 500 offices of the Holy See. We had identified more than 2,500 record series that we were able to link to those specific offices that had generated the records. So we had began to assemble a database of some substance. Okay, problems begin to emerge. There are always problems, and this was no exception. By 1993, I had hoped some of the archivists at the Vatican Archives would take an interest in our work, or at least take a look at the database printouts we had prepared. But as time went on, there was no word or expression of interest. We generated several printed versions of the contents of the database. In 1993, we generated a 2,000-page printout with all the technical stuff that you have in a database. And then a year later, we generated an 800-page version with all of that stripped out to make it easier to read. However, as far as I know, no one in the Vatican Archives ever looked at it. So, at least no one ever discussed the printouts with me. Secondly, we were exploring just how the database would be mounted in the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library had just received a GIAC computer. I don't know if anybody knows a GIAC computer. I think it's old stuff. But it was a big deal then. And in 1989, Paul Weston of the Vatican, the digital guy at the library, was confident he would have no problem mounting the individual MARC records into GIAC. But in order to do so, he would need to work with someone from the Vatican Archives. But no one from the Vatican Archives was ever designated for that purpose. 3, in addition, there was a real technical challenge in how to link the information on individual record groups to the specific agency, the kind of umbrella of the agency that created the records. Len Coombs brilliantly devised a system that would permit the linking of record series data with the office that had generated the data, but that system was not, it's just a little clunky. It was not really user-friendly. This was all before the internet. The internet, it would have solved this, beautifully, but we didn't have it at that time. So to accomplish, to achieve a solution, we would have needed a specific design. And the design would require a meeting of staff from our project, the Vatican Archives, and the Vatican Library to explore how to mount this material and deliver it in a user-friendly way. And though we tried at several points to organize such a meeting, Paul Weston at the library was reluctant to proceed without specific direction from the Vatican Archives, and no direction was given. 4, in the spring of 1993, I was told that I would no longer have access to the stacks to check on our data as we reviewed the material. That visit in 1993 was the last visit I would pay to the Vatican Archives. Father Metzler wrote that the staff would no longer permit staff access, and moreover, he wrote that he was 73 years old and had very little interest in automation. He said the project was of no use to the archives since it was just assembling information that they already knew. In my view, the enthusiasm for our work could not be sustained in face of the opposition from the staff, and in particular from his vice prefect, the Reverend Sergio Pagano. But the good news was we had pretty much completed all our work. So, a bit earlier, in 1993, I began to be concerned that the project might stall with these goings-on. But unfortunately, we had accepted no funds from the Vatican, so I wasn't subject to any oversight in how the work progressed. At the same time, however, I had accepted considerable funds from American foundations and had to show some tangible product for the work that we had done over the previous 3 years. With that in mind, and this is another long story made short, I accepted an invitation to publish the data in printed form with Oxford University Press. So in 1995, I, along with Len Coombs, my wife Joy, who was an editor, began the long process of adapting the database information into a printed guide. And late in 1996, we submitted the final text to Oxford University Press. Meanwhile, in 1995, it was announced that Father Metzler would retire. And in 1997, it was announced that his vice prefect, P. Sergio Pagano, the longtime vice prefect, who I had never met, would become the new prefect. That same year, news arrived that Father Boyle would step down as prefect of the Vatican Library. So with these changes, any hope of meeting to mount the data into the GIAC computer at the Vatican Library had ended. Paul Weston wrote that he did not have authority to hold such discussions, and he soon departed the Vatican Library. In January 1997, I wrote to the new prefect, Father Pagano, to congratulate him on his appointment as prefect and mentioned our project, noting that we had accomplished what we had accomplished over the past 8 years. I offered to meet with him to explore possibilities and next steps. Very quickly, he replied that actually the Vatican Archives was working to develop its own database and would have no interest in our work by external peoples. He then said, I found myself to tell you as soon as possible that the project you exposed, interesting without any doubt, cannot be realized. In any case, this prefecture was not informed about it and never approved or authorized it. So with that, it was clear that I would no longer have any connection with the Vatican Archives. But with that realization, I simply responded that, saying that our work is done, and we expect to have a final report ready, and I will submit that to those who had funded the project, and let it go at that. So in November of 1997, I received the first copies of the published book, which I have here. So I immediately sent a copy to Father Pagano, overnight express mail. And in the letter accompanying the book, I simply stated that I enclosed what is the final report of our work at the Vatican Archives and expressed gratitude to the archives and a hope that the guide, essentially a printout of the database, which is what that is, would be of some value. In his response, it was clear that Father Pagano, in fact, had been informed of our project, but did not expect that a publication was going to result, let alone from Oxford Press. He wrote that the book was not particularly useful, that it had many errors, and that we were not qualified to undertake such a work. Moreover, the guide, because it was not, in his words, scientific, would not be made available to the Vatican Archives reading room, nor would it be listed in any official bibliography of the Vatican Archives. It was, however, made available in the Vatican Library. In the ensuing months, the Oxford Guide received many positive reviews in the English-speaking world, as well as in France, Germany, and to some extent in Italy. Then in 1999, 2 reviews appeared by Father Pagano, the first in Italian and the second in French. Both similar in content were very negative and questioned our ability to take on such a project. Both were disappointing, especially since they seemed to focus on small errors, and there were errors, but did not address the larger question of the validity of our approach to the description of the archival funds of the Holy See, nor did they engage the possibilities this had for adapting to new technologies. So anyway, my relationship with the archives had come to an end. But by 1998, the work was done. Publication was completed. And ironically, in 1998, in that very year, it was announced that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, established in 1641, would open its archives for research for the first time in 400 years. This included the archives of the post-Reformation Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books. So we received a small grant from the Del Mas Foundation for me to go to Rome and describe that archive consistent with what we had done before and created a small supplement. So from that point, in 2004, the project was finished. Though over subsequent years, I did keep in touch with friends and colleagues at the Vatican Library. And I did learn, interesting, during the pandemic, to bring it up more recent, during the pandemic, that the Hathi Trust had digitized the entire text of the Oxford volume and that it was searchable. However, it was restricted, access was restricted because of copyright. In May of 2022, I decided to write a colleague at the library, who I do, Paula Manoni, the librarian for digital material, to alert her of the availability of this new tool and offered to work through copyright issues, since the University of Michigan held the copyright, to make the digital version available for the Vatican Library. I heard nothing in reply, which was not unusual. In the fall of that year, though, I decided that I would travel to Rome in March, the following fall, in March 2023. So in December 2022, in my regular Christmas card to the prefect of the Vatican Library, I mentioned that I would be in the city and be glad to stop by, which I often did when I was in Rome. As the trip firmed up, I notified the prefect, Monsignor Pacini, of my dates in Rome, and he wrote back that I should stop by the Vatican Library for a meeting on March 9th. So I arrived that day at the Vatican Library, 10 a.m., for this meeting. And let's see, I have a slide of that. Where is this? Yes. So there, in this the ceiling is wonderfully frescoed from the 16th century, that was once the main entry room to the reading room of the Vatican Library, was the group assembled. Monsignor Pacini on the right, and then right to left was Monsignor Mantovani, the new incoming prefect. And then on the left side, me and Paolo Manoni. But then in the center is a man named, to my complete surprise, was Paolo Vian, the newly appointed vice prefect of the Vatican Archives. This was the first time since 1993 I had a chance to talk to anyone from the Vatican Archives. The purpose of the meeting, it turned out, was twofold. The first was for Dr. Vian to request formally that the digital information that we had created in preparation for this guide be transferred to the Vatican Archives so they could make use of it. Then the second was to tell me that the Oxford Guide we had prepared 25 years earlier was extremely important to the Vatican Archives, as it was finally contemplating preparing its own guide. Dr. Vian noted that for 4 centuries, the existence of the Vatican Archives, it was generally accepted that the collection was too complicated to sustain any effort to prepare a comprehensive guide. That was until the appearance of what we did. The group wanted to express their long overdue appreciation and respect for our work. So subsequent to that meeting, I corresponded with Dr. Vian, who wanted to know more about the background, and a lot of what I'm telling you is what I told him about the story of the project. In responding, he said, and I'm quoting, "Thus, in the memory of the history of the Vatican Archives, your name," and he means all of us who worked on this project, "will always be remembered for your courage, your dedication, your commitment to the enterprise. Any work such as ours in recent years for a guide to the Vatican Archive cannot be separated from yours and your work, which constitutes a milestone in the history of knowledge and description of the funds of the Vatican Archives. In recent years, in the archive, I have realized how truly complex and difficult the work of a guide is, a work that makes your veins your veins and pulses tremble. For this reason, our admiration and gratitude towards you will increase and grow, not decrease as the years go by. I will keep you informed of the developments of our work, and we always count on your precious support and generous friendship. I mean, I just took my breath away. And just an interesting footnote here, in corresponding with this man, Paulo Vian, he mentioned how interested he was that I was connected to the University of Michigan because his father was here in 1933, working with William Warner Bishop on the Bishop Project funded by the Carnegie Endowment to modernize the catalog for printed works at the Vatican Library. So anyway, been in late summer of 2023 working with the University of Michigan Library staff. Because we did hold the copyright, we were able to get clearance to make the guide fully and freely accessible online and searchable through HathiTrust. So finally, in 2023, we had the guide, we had the information available online, and we had the kind of imprimatur, if you will, of the Vatican Archives. So it was very, just to conclude, it was very curious to me years ago why no one in the Vatican Archives had much interest in what we were doing. Father Boyle did and saw its potential, and upon reflection, I do believe that most of the staff of the Vatican Archives thought we were on a fool's errand. That is, they thought we had undertaken a project that was doomed to failure because it was just never thought even to be possible. The assumption was that a comprehensive guide to the Vatican Archives was impossible to achieve, let alone by a group of Americans. So I think that was why it was so easy for Father Pagano to dismiss the project when he first became prefect. The publication of the book was evidence that we had not failed, and thus must have taken the staff of the Vatican Archives by some surprise. What we had produced was by no means perfect. There were genuine flaws and errors, and I very much regret those. However, it's important to state what we had produced. We designed a framework that would identify all record groups in the Vatican Archives, and connect those groups to the offices of the Holy See that had generated those records. In the process, we had utilized a format that structured the data on each form throughout the archives and beyond in a uniform way. With this framework, we were able to seamlessly integrate and structure information on fonds generated by offices of the Holy See, but held in archives outside of the Vatican Archives proper. We were able to identify offices of the Holy See by which no records existed. And finally, the framework of structured data was and remains compatible with contemporary design for online management and access systems for archival material. The work clearly went beyond the frequently cited work that I showed you of Fink and Boyle. Though right now there is no plan for the Vatican Archives to create an online system, it is now, in my view, inevitable someday that I will not see, someday that will occur as this new project assembles information in a systematic way. Finally, out of all of this, and this is just a personal note, but there's a new appreciation of our work. This new appreciation of our work has emerged in tandem with a restoration of respect for Leonard Boyle, whose departure from the Vatican Library, and again this is a long story, was amid controversy and the worst of Vatican politics. He was without doubt the inspiration for this project and its constant guide. It is one piece of so many together that document his extraordinary vision for the Vatican Library and Archives. And interestingly, next Saturday, there's a symposium in his honor in Rome on the date of the centenary of his birth. And among the many of his achievements that will be discussed will be mention of the Bentley Library and its work at the Vatican Archives. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran. That was fantastic, and I mean, you can see why I'm waiting for the movie, right? This is just wonderful, and there's so much that we could talk about here. I guess I want to start though. You did a wonderful job of avoiding technical jargon and so forth. And a lot of the people here are archivists, but a lot aren't. And there is one term that you used frequently that I wonder if you could just elaborate on a little bit for the lay people in the crowd, and that's the word fond.
Oh, right. That's it's really a European term, and I mean, you can imagine that in any organization creates records, so you have the and at least in the paper world, I don't comment on the digital world. That's beyond me. But in the paper world, an organization would be divided between the personnel department and the finance department and the public relations department and whatever. And each of those, in the process of doing their work, would generate records of some kind or another. So when those things are transferred to the archives, they are the archives of the X organization. And those records are divided into what we call in the United States record series. So there would be the record series of the finance department, the record series of the personnel department, the record series of whatever. But in Europe, they call those fonds.
Okay. And a lot of this has to do with contextualization, right? I mean, this project was one vast contextualization of these fonds in terms of the offices and the functions and things like that. And I wonder if you could say just a little more about that, because part of that was aimed at the ultimate users of this, or the ultimate envisioned users of this.
I mean, you can't see this, but basically what it means is, I'm just opening to one section here, the Penitentia Apostolica, and it had jurisdictions for sacramental and non-sacramental acts. You have to read through it to get what that means. But what we did was, in the case of this, we wrote essentially a history, and Claudia Carlin was an authority on papal documents, so the history is primarily the authority. So what authorities led to the founding of this agency, changed its authority, what its work was supposed to be. So the idea is, if you know something about what this penitentiary did, and I'd have to read all the way through to tell you, then you can sort of predict what the documents might be in this particular section of the archives. So the Roman Rota would be another. That's easier to understand. It's the judicial, where they have trials. And so then following this description are lists of each of the record group, each of the fonds. And for each of the fonds, we have standard descriptive categories, which I could go into, but if you want to talk about afterwards, we could do that. But that's essentially, so contextualizing it really is relating the record series to the function of the agency that produced them.
And partly the goal is, again, I mean, thinking about the sort of the users. I mean, you had mentioned that people who. I mean, here's this vast collection. It's not just the church, as you were making clear. I mean, this is about European history. This is about world history. This is about so much of the humanity, right?
Right.
So then scholars who are operating in lots of different fields beyond church history, for instance, have a new resource by which they can start to identify where to look for what might be of interest to them. History of art, women's history, anything like that. I mean, can you say more about that?
That's a little bit harder, because once you veer away from the central purposes of the organization, the central processes, for example, the Congregation of Rites, which oversees all the processes for making saints. I know someone who's working in that area of the archives, for example. I mean, you can find out which saints they were working on and so forth. But when you get into more contemporary themes of historical analysis, like the history of women or the history of indigenous people, how you use those archives becomes more complicated. What you look for, how you find it. For example, in the Congregation of Whites, you could look for women saints, for example. That's a popular topic now. In the Congregation of the Propaganda Fide, it's interesting, there's a famous book by Ann Stoler, who used to be here at the University of Michigan, interested in the indigenous history of, I think it was the Dutch, Dutch colonies, and using the official records of the Dutch administration, you had to do what she said, read against the grain of the documents. In other words, the documents are created for one purpose, but you have to kind of read through them and in a subtle way try to figure out other players in whatever transaction is involved. So it's complicated.
Yeah. So, it's certainly clear from the talk that you had initial, strong support, of course, from Father Boyle, and enough support to complete the project.
Right.
But a lot of people, at a minimum, were not thrilled that you were doing this, and were even, even opposed. But you also had some friends who continued through the period that ultimately led.
Oh yeah, I mean, what was surprising is that we didn't really have opposition. That's why I do think they thought we were on a fool's errand. I don't know what they're doing, but whatever it is, it's not going to work. So I mean, they didn't really even muster energy to oppose it. They were just, we just sort of went along our work. We weren't dependent on them for money, so that was there was no periodic reporting involved. So we kind of had this idea and worked it through. And Father Boyle was extremely helpful if there were on a number of occasions, because he knew the archives pretty well. But we weren't in a hostile environment at all. We were just in an environment where people really didn't know what we were doing. We weren't in the way, so.
But even after, after the work was done, and or basically done, and you were excluded from the stacks, and it was made very clear to you that there was no official interest.
Right. I mean, that was disappointing. But it was great working with Oxford and getting that imprimatur on this press, because I knew we had to publish it. We had to do something. We had to publish it. It had to have some tangible thing. And I remember talking with the University of Michigan Press about that maybe they would be interested. And they were kind of talking about it, and it was a lot of information. And their solution was to have a kind of introductory volume with a packet of microfiche. Do you remember microfiche? And I was just sort of saying, this is kind of important, and we need to have a press that's going to reach the world, essentially. So I thought ideally it would be great if Oxford Press did it. So I wrote a blind letter to the editor and said, we're doing this work, and I think this would be great if you publish this. And it made me feel good, and I thought, I'll find somebody. But 2 weeks later, they called, and we were off and running.
So maybe just a couple more things, and then we'll open it to the audience. The opening of the talk with all of these wonderful examples of parts of the holdings. Are there any particular moments that stand out for you when you were standing in the stacks and were just stunned by something, or when anything along those lines?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the secrets of doing this kind of work is you draw a line and say, we're going to just drive things to this level, and we're not going deeper. Because if you start doing that, you get stuck. If you get into these series, you don't know what you're going to find. So we rarely got actually into the series. Things, just as now I'm thinking, things that struck me. There was a huge commission during World War II on World War II prisoners with pictures, and I remember being kind of stunned to find that, and the atrocities of World War II and how that was being documented. That that was interesting. I remember there's a restricted part of the archives, the material after 1922 when we were doing the work, but we could see through the grate, what the stuff was, and we actually were allowed to go in and take the marked data, but we couldn't look at the volumes. But I remember at the time working on the series on the diplomatic mission to Vietnam. I thought that would be interesting. So things like that always kept popping up. And
Right. So the last question is maybe, this is going to be an unfair question, right? Maybe too philosophical, but to whom does the archives belong? I mean, on the one hand, obviously, it belongs to the Catholic Church, right? It belongs to the Vatican. But you've completed a project that was completely outside of the Vatican operation that makes this all available to the world, right, in a different way. I just wonder if you have thoughts about who are these archives for?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, and I think that's really the challenge of really understanding the Vatican archives that's been going on for 400 years. I mean, essentially, the archives are the archives of the Holy See generated in the course of doing its work. So that's that's who they're for, really. So then the challenge is for all those people who find this a useful window for topics outside of the range of the comparatively narrow purposes and direction of the Holy See. How do you dig into it and find it? That's a real challenge. And one of the things the archives has done over the years is they have published a bibliography of all work done by scholars at the Vatican Archives. So if you publish something, you're supposed to send the citation to the archives so they can put it in this bibliography. So that's kind of an acknowledgement, in my view, that this archive really is for a broader scholarly public, where there are just hundreds of conversations going on informed by these records. And the only way, or at least one of the central ways of making that conversation useful in your own work, is to visit these citations, work through the previous work done, and see what that suggests for possibilities. So
Thank you.
it's on two levels.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you would wait, please, for the microphone so that we can get you on the recording.
Fran, I just wonder if you'll be at the event next weekend.
No, I can't go. I thought about it.
Thank you. Excellent. So, HathiTrust copyright, my window on the world, although I'm very curious. So the first round through, basically, HathiTrust digitized stuff, but it wasn't made available. You could search it, but you couldn't read it. Have I got that right?
So, well, the book was digitized, and you could search it, and it would tell you the page number where your search.
But you couldn't read it.
You couldn't read it.
But
It was under copyright.
Well, actually, nothing written in 1541 is under copyright. But I understand. People were very cautious in those days. But then later, if I understand your story right, the work was in fact readable. It was opened up. And what I'm curious about is whether the opening up part made the whole rest of the project not look like a fool's errand. Oh, I know what we can do with these books. We can read them.
No, it was a great step forward when we could do it, but we could only do that in the last 6 months or 8 months or something. But no, I was finally, you could tell people instead of, I think this costs $250, you can just go online and read it. And my understanding is anybody can read it on HathiTrust, isn't that right? You don't have to be...
You don't have to be a member of
anything,
No.
yeah, so it's available. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from the online audience.
Veronica asks that she's currently researching the Bureau of Catholic Missions regarding U.S. Indian boarding schools, and they were really struck by your perspective on access and institutional culture mirroring one another. She asks, when that's the case, do you have any advice for bypassing gatekeeping like that?
It's very difficult. And I have not, I've not been to the Vatican Archives really in 25 years. So when I first started working there in the 1980s, if you wanted to use the Vatican Archives, they actually gave you a form, a text form, and you sat down and literally wrote a letter to the Pope asking to use the archives, saying what reason. I think now you don't do that, but you have to be pretty explicit as to what you want to use and why. At least that has been historically the case. Now there's no religious test or anything, but it's mainly whether the materials is available.
There was a question over here, I think, yes.
This is kind of a two-part question. If you could kind of go back in time and get another 100 years added to your life, and you wanted to do a phase 2 of this project, what would you do to make it extend the project, make it better, make it even more useful than it is? And secondly,
I've thought about that. Thanks for that question. The big thing that's changed since we did this was the internet. And we could do wonders with this, with the internet. The visual representation of the organization, changes. I sometimes just dream about that.
Well, that really answered part of my second question, which was, what about AI? Does AI have any relevance to what?
Well, that is. I've been thinking a lot about that too. Paul, remember we were at a group the other night. Scott Page was talking about AI and the idea of prediction. How AI can assemble a lot of information that informs prediction, and I really have been thinking about that because unlike when you catalog a book, you sort of try to encapsulate the possible uses of it by subject terms and so forth. But archives doesn't do that. Archives, and the reason why context is so important for the archives is that the more you know about the agency that produced the records, the processes, the context, whatever, the better you can predict what's going to be in those records. And Scott was saying, if you have artificial intelligence that can go through, as I said, this bibliographia, probably 10,000 pages of citations. If somebody can go through all those texts and assemble them, the knowledge you would have of the potential of each of those fonds or record series would be quite extraordinary. But I dream about that too. Don't do it. You're lots of free time. Right.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear myself. So, if you've got it all, say you could put it all online, all of your research, which from the size of that book is not actually a huge amount of information, given the current state of things. Has anybody at the Vatican or elsewhere tried to digitize that?
I'm sorry, I don't quite hear you.
Have they tried to digitize that collection?
Have they tried to
Digitize,
digitize?
a la Google going around and scanning just about
There
anything
are a
they
lot
get
of
their hands
scannings
on.
going on. I think I didn't mention it, but I saw somewhere where the archives claims to have 7 million digital images. I don't know what that means. I think it's when people write and want to get digital copies of things, they must be creating a I mean, they must be saving copies of all this digitization that they're doing. I have not seen any guide. This list that they put out every year, it makes no mention of if there's any digital access to any of this. So I just don't know.
But 45 miles of archive's going to be more than 7 million pages.
Oh no, I mean that would be a drop in the bucket, but it's something, right?
Other questions?
Just to gain physical access to the stacks, how unprecedented was that?
It was totally unprecedented. I was the first time. Father Boyle said he couldn't get it. It was, and we arrived in Rome. Beth was already, she got her apartment, Catherine, they were all set. We arrived in Rome for the first day. We're getting ready to work, and Father Messer comes in and says, you know, the staff has decided we don't think you can get into the stacks. And he said, but we're going to give you 2 desks in the reading room, and everything you need will be brought to you. And I said, you know, that's everything. So fortunately, I had correspondence where he signed off on that, and we had a little to do, but we did get it was unprecedented. And it was free. I was free. We went anywhere. It was. I mean, that apart from just seeing different things, just actually wandering the stacks was quite extraordinary.
I can imagine. Anybody else?
I was just wondering how the experience of working in the Vatican archives compared to other projects that you've worked on, you know, with like maybe other private institutions or governments or things like that, like, because it sounds like you had free reign. Is that uncommon, or?
What's the last part?
Oh, it just sounded like you had like free reign at the Vatican. Is that common? Is that typical of your other archiving projects?
I think your hearing isn't what it used to be.
You had free reign at the Vatican. Was that like other places that you've been?
Oh, thank you. I've been to many archives throughout the world, and of course, given great tours and seen wonderful things. But it's very unusual to let people just wander through the archive. I, before or since, have never, other than wandering the stacks of the Bentley Library, of course, which is its own thrill, never had a chance, something like that. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I'm curious if, in addition to paper archives, you were able to see any 3D archives, artifacts or relics of the Vatican. If so, what was that like, and did you include that in any of your archival research?
No, we didn't do no three-dimensional objects. We did not. The Vatican archives. I'm trying to think. The only three-dimensional things that are a big deal at the Vatican archives are seals, sealed document. A seal. Some have quite elaborate royal seals in terms of correspondence. So there's a whole division of the Vatican archives that just deals with that. No, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is interesting in that there was a section in the archives that dealt with, I forget the Latin term, but it's essentially an excess of faith. We think that they worry about people losing their faith, but these are people who had too much, and they had drawings of objects that were just crucifixes with blood and you know, relics and things like that they thought were a little over the top and should be reined in a little bit. But we never. I saw the drawings of the objects, but I didn't see the objects per se.
Thank you.
Garen, outside.
Before a certain date, was everything on parchment? At what point did paper start coming in?
I mean, with in 1588, with the establishment of the bureaucracy, you know, paper was everywhere. I mean, there was just a lot of paper, even in the 16th century. I couldn't really date the switch from parchment. The early registers are certainly on parchment, and some of the early monastic documents, which are the ones that go back to the 8th and 9th century, those are parchment. But I don't, I mean, there's just so much paper. I didn't see a lot of parchment. It certainly didn't work with it. Yeah. But it's interesting.
The 1588 and the bureaucracy, I mean, in a way, the Vatican, I mean, the Vatican, the Church, it's a modern institution. It's an early modern institution.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
And there are very few bureaucracies established before that time.
Right, and it was a bureaucracy that organized the work of the organization around the globe in 1588.
Right.
So the records are quite stunning.
And yet, of course, also, as like many long-lasting institutions, there's a certain conservatism, just like with universities, right?
Well,
It's built-in conservatism.
That would be an interesting question. But
We have an online question.
John asks, have you read the book The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco?
oh yes, yes, long time ago.
It seems that it seems that this novel was very informed about the culture of knowledge with the Vatican. And John's curious, what do you think about that culture of knowledge in the Vatican, especially the tension between orthodoxy and modernity and how that came out in the archive?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I read it a long time ago, and actually before I'd done this work. So I don't know where. I mean, there's a lot of stuff written on the Vatican, and including the Vatican. I thought you were going to mention what's his name, Dan Brown. You know, you know, there's a lot of exaggeration, and I mean, in a way, it's kind of boring. I mean, it really is. They really are bureaucratic records, and they go on and on and on. So we were just looking at it from a different point of view, and we weren't looking for sensational things. Yeah.
This is just a simple question. The Father Frank Canfield you mentioned at the beginning, was he a Jesuit?
No. He was from the Archdiocese of Detroit. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one last question, if anybody has one.
It's just a comment, but Fran, having been one of your staff people, coming in just as you were getting through the big amount of work you were doing, I was aware of this project peripherally, but hearing about what you did tonight, your perseverance, I am just in awe of this story, but more in awe of what you did to make it happen, and the fact that at the very end now you are getting the validation, and it's looking like it's actually really extremely useful ongoing and into the future. I just want to say congratulations to you, because there had to be a leader, and this came out of your head, and you persevered and you pushed, and I just find that part of the story is the most remarkable to me.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's nice of you to say, and it was. I mean, I didn't have time really to connect all the people involved in this at every stage. So it was. It would have been impossible to do alone, but there were many people who wanted to see this done, And it was really fun.
Eventually.
Right. No, it was always fun. I mean, it was just because, I mean, nobody goes to the Vatican thinking they're going to have a wonderful experience. I mean, it just, I mean, it's a very complicated place. And I was fortunate to have met some wonderful people there. I mean, it was, and none of it was a surprise. But how to navigate it was a challenge. But thank you.
That's great. Yes, thank you, Sally, for that comment too. That's excellent. Well, Fran, thank you so much for
Well,
this.
thank you for having me. I'm honored to be part of this group. Thank you.
Thank you to the audience. Our next session of Making Michigan will be December 7th. This will actually be my last Making Michigan and one of my last formal acts as a U of M employee. So I've decided to take that opportunity to give a talk called 4 Years of Making Michigan and 4 Decades at Michigan, some reflections. I hope you'll join us. Thanks to Andrew Rutledge for monitoring the YouTube commentary, and thanks to the Michigan Media team. We're open Friday afternoons and Friday evenings for astronomy night. Tonight's session will be available online in about a week. If you're here at the observatory upstairs is going to be open until 9 o'clock. We have student docents ready to share things about it. They do a fantastic job. It's not quite as old as the Vatican Archives, but it has maybe some portion of the dust that's there. Anyway, it's the birthplace of U of M as a research university. So please, if you have a little time, go on upstairs. I don't know if are we observing tonight? Maybe. Yeah, okay. So you might be able to look through the telescope. If you're online, I hope you can get here sometime. Until we all see each other again, be safe, stay well, and keep hope. And good night. Thank you.
Thank you.